polls, future elections, political power struggles, and less on effectively solving problems. Let's be frank. And in the business community, there was a clear trend, which is now being mitigated, to look essentially into short-term objectives, to increase the value of shareholders. And to increase the value of shareholders is to bet on short-term measures to get short-term results and forget about the future, because the future we will see afterwards. So we badly need to change the mentality of decision makers in the public sector and in the private sector, and I would say it will be easier to do it in the private sector than in the public sector. But politicians need to understand, and sometimes we are faced with this kind of challenges. It is better to take today decisions that will eventually be not popular, but it will be essential to be able to shape the public opinion itself. My experience when I was in government is that when I was following the polls, I would have problems in the short term. And then when I was able to show leadership and go even to what was the prevailing trend of the opinion and take the decisions that were necessary to ensure the future of my country at the time, that in the end would pay. So my appeal to decision makers in the public and the private sector is, don't look about what's going to happen to you tomorrow, look into what's going to happen to all of us in the future, and to be honest, it is already happening now.
Oh, thank you. And I think what we would hope for is that people that aspire to be leaders, both in business and in governments, also think about what kind of legacy they want to leave.
And we need to create systems of stimulus that benefit long-term thinking, instead of the present systems that theoretically are conceived to benefit short-term results.
And I guess
this is very important.
Social media is maybe not helping when it comes to incentivizing long-term thinking.
No, I mean, we have in social media all kinds of things. We have fantastic contributions to social media for the most noble causes of humankind. And we have also the problems, in my opinion, of the business model of social media, in which, of course, the interest is to have as much interactions as possible and to reach as much people as possible. And as we know from traditional media, that what is news is not when a dog bites a man. What is news is when a man bites a dog. The algorithms and the business model of social media are constructed in such a way that they tend to expand the, I would say, the informations, the positions, the ideas that are more extreme, that are more controversial, that create more trouble. And so I think it's not a question of censorship that will solve the problem. The question is the business model needs to be redesigned, the algorithms need to be redesigned in order not to be based on evil to make profit.
No, it's such a good point. You know, when we grew up and read the papers, the editor took the pride in everything being correct in the paper. And now there's no editing. It's up to the individual to then assess if this is true or not.
Yes, but there is a responsibility of the platforms. I mean, one can argue if we have something, as you mentioned, in the media, and if someone is attacked in a way that is wrong, there is a possibility to go to the court. In social media, there is no responsibility. And I can understand the argument of social media platforms saying, well, this is put by people, so it's not our responsibility. But the truth is that the algorithms are made in such a way that they amplify in a preferential way a certain number of things. And when the algorithm amplifies, then there is, in my opinion, a responsibility, and there should be accountability including through the legal system in relation to those situations. At least when false information, defamation, all other kinds of things are benefited, are not only just what someone puts, but are benefited by the way the algorithm amplifies that. That creates, in my opinion, a responsibility of the platform.
No, thank you very much for that. Reflecting on the state of the world and listening to your very powerful speech, I was reflecting, have you ever in your career seen such a complex geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape?
Let's be clear. I think we are in the worst situation I remember in my lifetime. I mean, I have not lived the Second World War. If I had lived the Second World War, what I'm saying now would not make sense. But I really think we are in the worst situation of my lifetime. First of all, the climate threat is coming to a point of no return. We are using 1.6 planets, and we have only one planet to use. And the climate and the biodiversity issues have lost attraction for political decision makers. Everybody is concentrated now on the war in Ukraine, on the cost of living and other aspects, and there is a lack of the sense of urgency in relation to climate. And the question of climate, together with the question of biodiversity, is an existential threat that today is very close to a tipping point that makes catastrophes totally irreversible. And that would not be the case 10 or 20 years ago. We still had much more time to act, and we have not used that time to act sufficiently. So now we are on the verge of the irreversible changes that will completely undermine the future of the life in the planet as we today see it. Second, the geopolitical divide is different from what it was during the Cold War. The Cold War was easier because we had two blocks, and those two blocks had clear rules of engagement. No, they would create as much trouble as possible to the other bloc, but they had mechanisms to guarantee that if the trouble would become a threat to the two blocs themselves, they would stop whatever was happening by proxy anywhere in the world. Those mechanisms that were particularly relevant in relation to the nuclear disarmament and to the nuclear control mechanisms, those mechanisms have lost existence or lost capacity. People got used to the 90s, to the beginning of the 20th century, to the idea of the end of history, and there is no more a risk of a global confrontation. And so the confrontations today are more dangerous because there are less mechanisms to make sure that they do not get out of control. And this is what, for me, is worrying. On the other hand, in the two blocks, we had a total decoupling. But the total decoupling that existed with the two blocks was in a completely different global economic situation. This was before the great globalization surge. The great globalization surge was in the 90s. I mean, and now we leave the global globalization surge. Our economies became completely interlinked, north and south, east and west, and now there is a new divide that is coming with the risk of decoupling that I mentioned. And I think it is absolutely crucial that independently of the difference that exists, we are facing two cultural systems, two ideological systems, two historic memories, two political systems in many aspects, but we can't afford not to have the United States and its allies and China having a serious discussion on the questions relating to climate, to trade and to technology, and to find the forms of cooperation or regulation that are necessary to avoid a decoupling that would be a disaster of the global economy and to avoid the risks of future confrontations. Because today we start to quarrel about the economic things, being it semiconductors, access or other of this nature, and tomorrow you might be quarreling about more serious issues because there are some irritating factors that are there on the ground, some geopolitical problems that are not solved in the region, We have the Taiwan question, we have others. So it is absolutely essential, first of all, to be careful in controlling the risky situations and at the same time to establish mechanisms that rescue our global economy.
Talking about decoupling, and you also mentioned it in your speech, Secretary General, if there is a full decoupling, it will shave off a lot of growth, and we will lose out on prosperity, there will be more poverty. But don't you foresee, if there is decoupling, that could be just for like 10% of the goods? It could be related to national security, semiconductors, some technologies. And if you then can continue to trade on 90% of the goods, we're much better off. I think what you're addressing is that a full decoupling will be a catastrophe.
That's what we are seeing. What you said is what we are seeing now. I mean, as far as I understand, the trade between China and the US is growing. And the decoupling that is being tried is essentially in relation to technology. And we know the semiconductor situation. China still has a huge dependency on semiconductors, especially the semiconductors of the, I would say, more sophisticated dimension. They essentially are produced by Taiwan at the present moment, most of them. So there has been some attempts to limit the access of China to these kind of semiconductors and also to the machines that produce them. And the biggest producer is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands are reacting because they would like to keep their market, which is perfectly understandable. So for the moment, this is limited to certain areas of technology. The problem is that these areas of technology will shape the future economy. And so the risk is that if there is not a serious negotiation in relation to trade and technology, and I believe that serious negotiation is still possible, if there is no serious negotiation in relation to these areas, we might have consequences in the future when the areas that are now relatively minor in the global economy will probably become the central aspects of the future global economy that will be much more technological based than the present one.
And I think, unfortunately, you're right on this, because the rivalry between G2 is also based on controlling those technologies.
The idea that we can live with a G2 is an idea that should be put aside. The G2 would mean a G0. It would mean that we would not have the capacity to bring together the resources, the energy, the capacities, the technologies that we need to face the challenges that we are facing. Because climate will not respect the G2, demography will not respect the G2, and the dramatic situation of developing countries will not respect the G2.
Secretary General, last question. I wish we could have continued. It's so much insight. I think, as you mentioned also, the impact of the war in Ukraine has on food prices, energy, is substantial. Do you think there will be an end of this war this year? Do you think there will be an end of this war this year?
No, there will be an end of this war. There is an end of everything. But I do not see an end of the war in the immediate future, unfortunately. I mean, I do not see a chance at the present moment to have a serious peace negotiation between the two parties. Let's be clear, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that was in violation of international law and the values of the Charter, has created a situation in which, because to a large extent, the two sides have a basic disagreement on the past. And it's always very difficult to solve disagreements on the past. Two different ideas about what the Russian Empire was, what the nationalities were, and two different ideas about what today are Ukrainians and are Russians. It is clear that, in my opinion, this makes it more difficult to find a solution. But that solution needs to be based on international law and needs to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I don't see conditions for that to happen in the immediate future. what we are doing, and we are very strongly engaged, is in relation to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which I must say it's quite amazing that with 2 countries in war it's possible to have an agreement in this regard, but also the Russian exports that are necessary for the global food security. We have been dealing with the problems of rescuing civilians in difficult situations like Azovstal in the past. We have been discussing with both sides the exchange of prisoners of war. We are supporting the International Agency of Atomic Energy, that is a UN body, in relation to Zaporizhzhia now in relation. So, I mean, we are doing everything we can, and this is probably one of the most important areas of our activity, to limit the damage, to reduce the suffering of the people, and to reduce the impacts, the dramatic, devastating impact in the global economy, because it came on top of the COVID, on top of the inequalities, on top of the climate problems. So we are trying to address the consequences, but for the moment, I don't think that we have a chance to promote or to mediate a serious negotiation to achieve peace in the short term. So we will have still to wait and to be clear on our principles, and our principles are international law, the values of the Charter, territorial integrity, but at the same time to try to do everything we can, talking to both sides and to other actors, in order to minimize the impacts on the suffering of the Ukrainian people and on the global economy, especially in the most vulnerable countries.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. I'm sorry we had to end on such a somber note, but I think it's reflecting the world we are living. I think many of us do hope for the Secretary General's good offices and the United Nations and multilateralism in such a situation. So thank you very much for your leadership, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. All the best.